This is an artificial intelligence Gothic session, which we're very, very excited about. It feels something very new, something very, very topical. And we've got Tobias Wilson-Bates, Dr. Tobias Wilson-Bates, who is an assistant professor in the English department at Georgia Gwinnett College. So he's joining us from the US. He researches the technological and narrative history of time as a means of understanding how industrialization changed the storytelling practices of the 19th century. He has published on education, time travel in anime, clocks in Dickens, the origins of AI, and Anthropocene time. His current book project on time machines and extraction is titled Holes in Time. So over to you, Tobias, for artificial intelligence.
Thanks so much for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here. So I'll just jump right into it and, touch wood, this isn't too boring. I've tried to make it interesting as much as possible. So I'd like to begin the talk by introducing a few literary historical figures that we'll be thinking with. And I'm especially interested in giving you a sense of how deeply intertwined early ideas of artificial intelligence were with the Gothic. And the Gothic, in this case, very much about how it overlaps with early Romanticism. So there's a bunch of schools of thought and abstract ideas involved in this discussion, and I think it would be easier to keep them all in order by attaching those ideas to the sort of principal actors concerned in circulating them. Although obviously there's much more because large movements and concepts are much deeper than just kind of a parade of individuals. But my talk is emergent from a study of Frankenstein, so it's worth taking Mary Shelley, maybe. Worth taking Mary Shelley as our starting point, the romantic circle that famously led to the writing of the text, her partner Percy Shelley, and George Gordon Lord Byron. We could also mention Polidori, but we don't have to. We can connect this group to Samuel Taylor Coleridge, whose Rime of the Ancient Mariner is one of Frankenstein's primary intertexts. And specifically, the reason I'm bringing everybody in, because I'm sure this is pretty familiar to everybody, is to extend it a little bit further to also include Anne Isabella Milbank, that's Lady Byron. Her marriage to Lord Byron resulted in a single child, Augusta Ada Byron, Ada Lovelace. So Ada Lovelace, from very early in her life, she was something of a math prodigy. I'm not sure if it's apocryphal, but the story goes that Lady Byron, after her separation from Lord Byron, kept Ada away from poetry essentially her entire life, with the idea that she would be sort of infected by her father's poetic madness if she were involved in it, and instead had her tutored from a very early age, almost entirely in mathematics, resulting in part in her being something of a math prodigy. So she goes on to collaborate with Charles Babbage, and he invents the difference engine and the analytical engine. So these are two machines that we recognize as early iterations of modern computers. You may know Babbage already, as his friend Charles Dickens caricatures him in Little Dorrit via the inventor Daniel Doyce. So there's a whole lot of names. Once you get into the kind of Dickens salons, you end up touching, Gaskell and Bronte and the broader kind of Gothic community of the period. But my point in introducing this social circle is to show that the degree of separation between the author of Frankenstein, writing the paradigmatic creation of a technological mind, and the engineers and mathematicians developing early versions of a mechanical mind are practically non-existent. That essentially the Romantic Gothic and early ideas of artificial intelligence are sort of co-emergent from this moment in history. And part of what this talk will be about is the various ways they're not just co-emergent, these ideas are actually deeply entangled with one another. We can't necessarily think artificial intelligence without the Romantic Gothic, and in some ways, artificial intelligence and the technologies that were manufactured during this period lead into what we see as the sort of modern Gothic. So there's one other piece that we have to touch on as well before we really kick into the talk, and that's what exactly artificial intelligence is, which is a bit of a muddle of a term. Like, if you think Gothic is hard to define, artificial intelligence is a whole other sort of can of worms or wires or one such thing. So it's also worth saying that it's a bit anachronistic talking about artificial intelligence in the early 19th century because this is a 20th century sort of coinage, although not necessarily the idea. And once again, that's part of what this talk is looking to disentangle. So the phrase itself, artificial intelligence, comes from this 1955 Dartmouth Summer Project. in which John McCarthy, Marvin Minsky, Nathaniel Rochester, and Claude Shannon, among others, pursued the idea of mechanically simulating intelligence. In contemporary discourse, this is still broadly the common meaning for artificial intelligence. We could think about it as mechanically driven simulations of initially human activity, and specifically human activity, often intellectual activity. What this means in real terms, though, was not one technology or technique, but rather it was an umbrella term and really sort of a marketing term, because like all academics, what they were doing was just trying to get funding for their institutes and workshops and stuff. And there were a whole bunch of different sort of schools of thought, techniques, proto-softwares that actually were sort of fall under the umbrella term of artificial intelligence. So this includes things like number theory, feedback loops, cybernetics, symbol systems, automata theory, and information processing. And the leap from those mathematical abstractions to the fraught idea of intelligence is in many ways a fiction far more fantastical than a young Swiss scientist reanimating a corpse. The technologies that incorporate artificial intelligence into their processes are clear descendants of the mechanisms designed by Babbage, and then later another figure who I'll touch on later in the talk, Alan Turing. The term AI carries with it not only McCarthy and Minsky's initial goals for the project, but also the inherent mechanistic rationale of its forefathers. The machine simulates thought without pretending to any transcendence to the unclear threshold of consciousness. Although this idea of like simulating a thing that resembles human thought versus actually a thing being called human thought then becomes the sort of central contention of everybody talking about this topic, even now, when you're talking about replacing labor with various kinds of technologies. And it's worth saying as well, like to distinguish, to pull this thread out of the kind of Gothic artificial intelligence, it's worth noting that long before the Dartmouth Summer Workshop, the idea of intelligence granted to artificial beings existed in a lot of cultural figures. Kalos, a giant bronze oil-fueled automaton from Greek mythology. In the late 18th century, a variety of automata were brought to life by the intricate engineering of Jacques de Vaucanson. In speculative fiction, E.T.A. Hoffmann's 1816 Der Sandmann is often cited as a movement towards imagining the workings of a machine mind. And by the late 19th century, the idea appears in longer discourses such as Edward Page Mitchell's The Ablest Man in the World, Samuel Butler's Erewhon, and George Eliot's Shadows of the Coming Race. In the 20th century, Arthur C. Clarke and Robert Heinlein, among many others, moved speculation concerning AI towards the imagination of an emergent phenomena of sufficiently complex data processing systems. The result of this linguistic evolution is that AI exists in technical discourse as a mechanical simulation run on hardware, but in speculative fiction as a frequently disembodied meditation on the emergent nature of conscious thought. So that's sort of the timeline. And like when we're looking at this rupture, the sort of romantic turn or Gothic turn, as those two overlapped. And so in other words, none of this was new in the clearest sense of the term. But what was new was the way its inventors in both the 19th and 20th centuries considered its activities and how an increasingly industrialized society blurred the idea of man as a complex machine and complex machines as potentially possessing forms of consciousness. So you can imagine these two trends kind of moving towards each other, and as you'll see later in the talk, meeting up in the figure of Frankenstein's monster. So returning to the early 19th century, in 1824, the president of the Astronomical Society of London, Henry Colebrook, commended the efforts of the society's controversial mathematician, Charles Babbage, who, to refer back to the earlier slide, is the collaborator of Ada Lovelace, the daughter of Lord Byron, the, bud of Mary Shelley. Babbage was undertaking the creation of his difference engine, which Colebrook imagined would usher in a new technological era. This is the quote: "In other cases, mechanical devices have substituted machines for simpler tools or for bodily labor. But the invention to which I am adverting comes in place of mental exertion. It substitutes mechanical performance for an intellectual process." In other words, quote, "Mr. Babbage's invention puts an engine in the place of the computer." And it's really interesting to think about. There's some interesting studies on how the term computer moves from a professional term for people who do like actuary tables and this kind of stuff into a thing we think purely of as a machine. But it's interesting to think that in this initial moment, machine and computer are actually two separate categories, and the computer one is the human one. Implicit in the creation of the difference engine and in his later analytical engine is Babbage's claim that a meaningful portion of human thought may be replicated through algorithmic calculations. If not a full-fledged mechanical brain, Babbage and his later collaborator Ada Lovelace continually anthropomorphized the machine's actions. In 1838, Babbage conceded that, quote, in substituting mechanism for the performance of operations hitherto executed by intellectual labor, the analogy between these acts and the operations of mind almost forced upon me the figurative employment of the same terms. They were found at once convenient and expressive, and I prefer to continue their use. Babbage was famously hard to work with. In fact, that's why his machines both failed eventually, is the engineer that he was collaborating with to make the machines ended up in a huge dispute over who actually owned the machine, the person who constructed it or the person who developed the idea. Just pauses computing for about 100 years. Hence, he was committed to phrases such as, quote, the engine knows, to describe its predetermined move from one calculation to the next. The machine might be an automaton, but it carried intelligence. Lovelace puts the issue like this, and this is from the excerpt, part of the excerpt that I sent to everyone. Although it is not itself the being that reflects, it may yet be considered as the being which executes the conceptions of intelligence. This quote from Lovelace's notes on Luigi Manebria's writing on the analytical engine was part of a larger project of Lovelace's that sought to develop the concept of a poetical science, in which scientific logic would be driven by the imagination. And it's always really interesting, not that we have to go into the personal lives, although obviously I started this way, to think about her relationship with her father, where she basically didn't have a relationship. She was kept from her father throughout her life. He died when she was still quite young. But she names her first child Byron, and she's buried next to her father. And so there's a lot of interesting kind of biographical material about Ada Lovelace's relationship to poetry and how she weaves that into kind of her mathematical imagination. The code that Lovelace developed to illustrate her ideas concerning the analytical engine has often been referred to as the first computer language, but her underlying assumptions echo the task that Shelley took on in her novel, the representation of intelligence and the ethical dilemmas over the production of an operational mind. Lovelace was not alone in imagining ways that the human mind could be understood and replicated via analysis. John Herschel, Babbage's longtime collaborator, imagined that human agency could be mapped mathematically. Thought and memory, for Herschel, involved the extension of intention over time. A schematic of his theory reveals the conceptual fixity of time in examining thought. So we're doing like a little hinge here to start thinking about the way time seems to show up here, but might be a little bit more complicated than Herschel's willing to make it. As the denominator in these equations, time produces the illusion of memory and intention as extratemporal elements. What Herschel obscures in such an equation is a parallel theory of temporality, time as clock time, measurable and standard in its operations and effects on human experience. There's a bit of a sleight of hand here. Machines allow for the precise measurement of time in such a way that it seems to be a control for understanding consciousness. But there is a distinct possibility that time, understood in this manner, tells us more about machines than it does about consciousness. We've become inundated with this philosophical blurring of the human and the machine. One of the things I always like pointing out to is in 2018, we passed what's called the internet inversion, the point at which more of the information on the internet is generated by bots and text-generating algorithms than composed by humans. So that when we operate in these kind of deeply technological environments, a lot of what happens over and over again is that we end up caught in a sort of worldwide Turing test. We're exposed to machines algorithmically designed to simulate the processes of human expression as if composed by humans. For those of you only tangentially aware of what Turing called the imitation game, which they made, the movie about his life, they then named that. His famous article on the topic is fascinating for setting the conversation that would follow about thinking machines. And also, although I ended up cutting it out of this talk, and I can talk about it later, he engages quite a bit with both Babbage and Lovelace in the talk. So people talk about Turing as sort of the father of modern computation, but it's interesting that he's directly and explicitly in conversation with these thinkers from the early 19th century. So this is, and I apologize, this is a longish quote, but he was a really entertaining writer. So I'm just going to read a little bit from his 1950 Computing, Machinery, and Intelligence, in part because this is very much where we get the kind of modern concept, how it circulates today. So, quote, I propose to consider the question, can machines think? This should begin with definitions of the meaning of the terms machine and think. The definitions might be framed so as to reflect, so far as possible, the normal use of the words, but this attitude is dangerous. If the meaning of the words machine and think are to be found by examining how they are commonly used, it is difficult to escape the conclusion that the meaning and the answer to the question, can machines think, is to be sought in a statistical survey such as a Gallup poll, which is what does everyone think of this thing? But this is absurd. Instead of attempting such a definition, I shall replace the question by another, which is closely related to it and is expressed in relatively unambiguous terms. The new form of the problem can be described in terms of a game, which we will call the imitation game. It is played with three people, a man, a woman, man, A, oh, they've changed the lettering here, sorry, a man, a woman, and an interrogator, who may be of either sex. So the interrogator is C in this. The interrogator stays in a room apart from the other two. The object of the game for the interrogator is to determine which of the two is the man and which is the woman. He then goes on to dismiss this kind of first thing and think, what if we replaced the distinction between man and woman with man and machine? Although like the gender politics of Alan Turing are complicated in their own way. And the idea is if a machine can trick you into not being able to tell the difference between it and a man, then it has performed the activity of thinking, regardless of whether or not we think that maps onto sort of like philosophical category of thought. We cannot tell the difference between a machine thinking and a man thinking. That's the point of the imitation game. What's interesting is later in the paper, he goes on to dismiss in its entirety the possibility of machine consciousness, and that this question be replaced almost entirely by the question of the imitation of consciousness. So this is the other quote. It was suggested tentatively the question, can machines think, should be replaced by, are there imaginable digital computers which would do well in the imitation game? The original question, can machines think, I believe to be too meaningless to deserve discussion. He's just spent like 8 pages discussing it, and he's like, and then he blows it off. Nevertheless, I believe that at the end of the century, the use of words and general educated opinion will have altered so much that one will be able to speak of machines thinking without expecting to be contradicted, which is pretty prescient on his part. I do think that like we talk about our computer's memory or this kind of stuff without any kind of cognitive dissonance. I believe further that no useful purpose is served by concealing these beliefs. The popular view that scientists proceed inexorably from well-established fact to well-established fact, never being influenced by any unproved conjecture, is quite mistaken. Provided it is made clear which are proved facts and which are conjectures, no harm can result. Conjectures are of great importance since they suggest useful lines of research. Once again, he's a very slippery thinker, and he's essentially saying here, like, why don't we just do fiction, you know? And what's interesting is in the kind of final section of the paper, this is very much what he proposes. This is the final quote. After, in the process of trying to imitate an adult human mind, we are bound to think a good deal about the process which has brought it to the state that it is in. We may notice 3 components. 1, the initial state of the mind, say, at birth. 2, the education to which it has been subjected. And 3, other experience not to be described as education to which it has been subjected, which is, say, the random experience of life. Instead of trying to produce a program to simulate the adult mind, why not rather try to produce one which simulates the child's? If this were then subjected to an appropriate course of education, one would obtain the adult brain. Presumably, the child brain is something like a notebook, as one buys it from the stationers, rather a little mechanism and lots of blank sheets. So I'm done reading you, Turing. That's, that's all of the imitation game paper. A manufactured being with a child brain, beginning blank and then traced through its growth like a notebook, sounds like nothing so much as, at last, the narrative at the center of the Gothic's engagement with the concept of artificial intelligence, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. I know all of you came here for dead bodies, and we haven't been exploring the right kind of dead people yet, so let's get to that. Specifically, I'm going to be talking about time in the novel. And this is emergent from a chapter called Frankenstein that is coming out next month in a collection on kind of modern interpretations of Frankenstein. So the rest of the talk is going to be about how perhaps the signature achievement of Frankenstein And we might consider this as Shelley's rebuttal of attempts to circumscribe consciousness was the novel's recognition of romantic concepts of time with emergent mechanistic theories. This is a conversation between a poetics of life, something like the romantic spontaneous emotions recollected in tranquility, with an emergent form of industrial consciousness that I would argue we experience now in its much later form as artificial intelligence. One way we might think about the Gothic is as an aesthetic category, is an articulation of the rupture that happens during this period. Texts like Rime of the Ancient Mariner, The Sandman, Dickens' Mudfog Papers, Stoker's Dracula, all stage encounters with the blurred threshold between life and non-life, or conversely, the possibility of artificial life. But, and this will surprise you, we need to also look at another semantic problem generated by this genre. What is a life or alive? If we're going to produce an artificial version of a thing, we first need to come to terms with what the thing is. For the last 250 years or so, the realist version of a life has been engaged through the concept of realism, and perhaps its most theorized form is the novel. Megan Ward makes the argument that what we take for realist character is in fact a series of algorithmic processes, a set of patterns that we come to think of as more real than others. One character, say someone like David Copperfield, will appear more real than another character, like the big bad wolf or something like this, by the implementation of a series of techniques that produce aesthetic conceptual verisimilitude. The Gothic, in many ways, is both paired with realism and also a reaction against its elisions. Devin Garofalo describes realism as a series of erasures, the expunging of elements of the world that don't fit a generated notion of the expected real. Amitav Ghosh likewise critiques the concept that it requires a reader's expectations to align with the reality in the text. In other words, the real physical world that we exist in as bodies doesn't necessarily align with the perceived reality of a textual one. The Gothic rejects the erasures of realist representation while maintaining a hyperbolic attention to the elements of real lived experience like the uncanny, the absurd, and the perverse. This in some ways tracks with the purported project of Wordsworth and Coleridge in lyrical ballads, namely the explorations of the natural by Wordsworth and the supernatural by Coleridge, is sort of like tracing this rupture. When Mary Shelley writes in the Gothic mode, then, we can recognize therein an engagement with the ways that a category like the real operates when put under the dual pressures of scientific industrial progress and Gothic display. The result in Frankenstein is actually several projects operating simultaneously across the text, which shouldn't be surprising given the structure of the text as a set of nested narratives. I want to address how Shelley uses narrative time, in particular as one of those projects, as a means to both represent and signal irreconcilable problems with the representation actuality of consciousness in the text. In this way, she predates Turing's work on intelligence while touching on many of the same ideas and concerns. And I think she articulates this the most fully in her kind of 1818 preface, where she talks about kind of the idea of the text as like engaging with something that could actually be, but using a lot of the same sort of artistic methods that something like the Tempest or the Iliad engages with. So the kind of landmark thing I'm talking about is that there's a technology in the construction of fictional character. Okay, so in the double existence of artificial intelligence, as signifying both a conversation about computing and emergent consciousness, one may find the unsettled question of time in the industrial period. By flattening time so as to combine experience with a unit of measurement, the industrial era's annihilation of space with time, that famous Marx quote, co-opted abstract notions of time into a denominator for the purpose of equating previously unlike units. And this you can imagine back to like that Herschel equation that does specifically that time is able to be a denominator, and this turns things like intention and experience into sort of the otherwise controlled variables of consciousness. So Frankenstein is a story that wrestles with the rapid transformation in science and industry that were altering the dimensions of early 19th century culture and representation. In the novel, Shelley confronted the difficulty of not just representing the production of a new life, but also how that creation would be expressed as textual information. Each of the novel's frames executes proto-scientific forms of knowing that are irreparably compromised by their simultaneous existence as self-reported building narratives. Which is to say, like, we have an Arctic explorer, we have a scientist, and we have a creature undergoing this sort of tabula rasa education. But each of those frames is destabilized because they're all self-transcribing or self-transcribing through reported speech of others. So I think this is like the first of many times that Mary Shelley pokes at like the idea of kind of scientific objectivity, progress, technology as somehow being able to escape these problems of reporting or communication or the medium of their communication. Central to this difficulty is the problem of representing new modes of industrial time, the organizing principle of the competing media that make up the novel's found text framework. The novel's problem, then, is not merely the question of creation. It also illuminates how existence under new forms of temporality undermine the possibility of rendering that creation objectively. The new scientific frontiers of galvanism and polar explanation do not offer the reader speculative futures, but rather resurface unanswered problems about authorship, realism, and comprehending human perception of time. And by figuring time into the text as a problem, the novel highlights the patterns that came to regulate the lived and imagined experience of technological modernity, that we're all living this, right? Like that even right here, communicating with each other right now, it's controlled by like network time protocols that synchronize time signals across the entire planet. These practices are presented throughout the text as an issue of representation. Readers receive the creature's narrative of emergent self-awareness third or even fourth hand via a series of transcribed letters, reporting past conversations and experiences. One is asked to understand the creature's nature only through recitation of its thoughts and actions. Shelley coordinates an intersection between the representational goal of the building genre, the artistic production of a represented human growth, and the romantic notion that poetic expression, as described by Samuel Taylor Coleridge, is an echo of a primary and original act of creation. So Coleridge, he has like a little spin on Plato where he talks about the primary and secondary imagination, the idea that the primary imagination is like God's act of creation, saying I am, and that everything creative and all creation is just like sort of echoes or mimics of that. And that what we do is sort of secondary imagination, which is that we're just kind of little DJs remixing creation. But in that way, like you can see how we're moving towards a kind of mechanistic theory of humanity because we are just moving parts around. We're just kind of building with Legos. We're not actually creating things, which is also really interesting with how the Romantics interact with copyright law, but that's a different talk. By writing a formation novel about a new technological act of creation, Shelley creates a text that interrogates mechanical reproduction, the building genre, and the romantic imaginary at once. Shelley's construction of the complex layers of temporal structure in Frankenstein highlight how time as an idea and time as a practice in both the public and private spheres were undergoing conceptual shifts, recognizably present in both industrialism and romanticism. The latter engaged with the subject with a series of thought experiments that sought to speculatively explore the reducible characteristics of human thought. In his notebooks, Coleridge postulates, quote, "What is nature? Multeity coerced into number and rhythm. How? By the word, and by every word that proceedeth in and through the same. Call the words numbers, numerant, living numbers, or ideas, or laws, or spirits, or ministrant angels, if you please, and which you please. The terms are all equivalent." And so, right, like numbers, thoughts are also numbers, and numbers are also angels. Angels are also spirits. Spirits are also numbers, right? Like there's a real kind of like proto-software concept. By flattening these terms, Coleridge reiterates the familiar transcendentalism of the Romantic movement. At the same time, he proposes the mind as a mechanism that produces meaning intelligible across a range of informational modes. Inherent in this proposition is the germ idea of computational intelligence. All expression is ultimately information, and organized mechanical expressions of numbers are explicitly the equivalent of words, ideas, laws, spirits, and angels. By placing nature, capital N, prior to its expressive vehicle, Coleridge makes the human mind only an incidental participant in the manifestation of intelligence. While for Coleridge, the conversion of words, ideas, and numbers into a single code allowed for potential access to an expression of a higher spiritual realm of creation, more empirical thinkers like Babbage and Herschel explicitly imagined such an equivalence as a new form of industrial philosophy. The two of them made a project of visiting factories and developing an analytical belief that language and thought could be translated into a set of mathematic symbols. In fact, a lot of Babbage's early kind of ideas about how machines should run came from visiting factories and imagining that a factory in toto is like a brain, and that essentially we can think about factory workers as like neurons operating within a larger brain system. Marx also has a lot of language like this, the idea that a factory system is actually a sort of like noosphere, like a grand cybernetic organism that's sort of eating workers. As William Ashworth described in his work on the industrial mind, their studies led them to the conclusion that the mind was rendered visible and open to empirical scrutiny in exactly the same way as any other object of scientific study or manufacturing site. The way was then open to the possibility of artificially building the same kind of intelligence into a machine. The Romantics were interested in what it meant to render the mind visible. Wordsworth's seminal project, The Prelude or Growth of a Poet's Mind, attempts to reveal the workings of his own consciousness stretched out across the canvas of his first 3 decades. While no one would mistake Wordsworth's poetry for Babbage's diagrammed factory operations, the Romantics nonetheless wrestled with a parallel form of inscribing thoughts as information. And it's a really great article titled Mediating Monstrosity, Media Information in Mary Shelley's Frankenstein by Andrew Burkett, describes the central scientific discovery of the novel as focused on media and equivalence. Burkett argues that for Victor Frankenstein, information is best understood as a virtuality abstracted from, though indeed connected complexly to, the material substrates that may variously embody it. Resultantly, Victor understands information as dematerialized and abstract, though nonetheless real. Otherwise stated, Victor perceives matter as a medium for embodying information. This realization of matter as a medium is materially echoed by the novel itself. Burkett describes the parallels between the monster's fragmented body and the textual body of the novel as a sutured together information structure and mediated narrative apparatus. Extending his thinking further, the novel also constitutes an initial foray into a form of realism that predicates its reality on the romantic and industrial temporality built out of a conscious equivalence between various sets of information that proposes time not as storytelling time, but as self-conscious groupings of data. And in the longer piece, which I don't do here, I go through and I show the kind of ratios of the different letter lengths attached to how much time passes in between the sending of each letter to look at like how everything is time stamped in the novel. And then there's actually work happening with how time is organized within this broader structure. So it's like, it really works mechanistically, intentionally, but problematically as well. Victor's various meditations on life, electricity, and information constitute one level of the novel's diegesis, while Shelley also organizes these various materials into a material substrate via the intentional artificial production of time. Her narrative experiment pays careful attention to the production of the sutures that hold together the text, even while exposing its artificiality. The pauses for epistolary time cues, transitions of narrator, and layered recitations of memories within memories create what Elisha Cohn describes as subtle disturbances in received categories of thinking, knowing, and doing that organize development. Time in the novel is never only developmental, but always also influenced by the presence of the storyteller's perspective and the heavy materiality of the found text framing device of the novel. So if we look back at like what Turing's talking about when he says, well, we need conjecture sometimes, hey, what if we made a child brain? Part of what Mary Shelley is doing to a question like that is she's like, sure, you can do conjecture, but you're not going to ever be outside of your own conjecture in the production of this like supposedly tabula rasa brain, which we recognize once again is like this is one of the central messages of Frankenstein. So when reading Frankenstein, we must be aware that the novel's argumentative work extends beyond the character and story all the way out to Shelley's structural decision-making, and that these decisions held further weight given their relation to fictional and cultural intertextual forms. Priscilla Benford argues that the novel's multi-level structure intentionally resists interpretive closure and traditional strategies of coherence. At stake in this resistance is a form of reading that is recursive as opposed to linear. So for Benford, that means like as you hit these like moments, these like sharp moments where, you know, Walton's like, I hear something. And you're like, what's going on? Then the next moment he's suddenly back and you've had the entire final interaction. You have these like weird like time jumps and stuff. What Benford says is like when you hit these moments, it forces you to rethink like, did you trust the thing that was happening before? Like, have you been invested in this kind of realist production in such a way that you've lost sight of the machine that's giving you access to it? To read Frankenstein is to become incorporated in alternate notions of temporality. Broadly speaking, the Romantics were fascinated by the effect of temporal patterns on the reader. Elizabeth Freeman traces the way that the virtual coherence of the family letter writing that makes up the body of the novel is undermined by the temporal gap between the moment of writing and the moment of receiving and reading the letter, such that the adjacent pages may both contain Justine Moritz's happy inclusion into the family, and the next page can have her imprisonment for the murder of William. Challenging normative representations of time in a text is also a way to reveal the social pressures inherent in representing self and family as information structures. The novel's temporal structure signals one of Shelley's intentional interventions, and the politics of time were clearly planned extensively and minutely. Isaka Joshua has a really wonderful piece on this called Marking the Dates with Accuracy, where she goes through, because there was some idea that like, well, this is just kind of a messy novel, but she talks about how much the time structures of the novel are intentional and align not just with each other, but also with like references outside of the novel, like Rime of the Ancient Mariner and this kind of thing. Such a system, Joshua posits, moves beyond the biographical arguments that have been proposed by critics to a system that challenges the reader to reconsider time via extensive calculation and hypothesis. Far from creating a complex coherence, though, Shelley's extensive planning seems intentionally to create a form of textually destabilizing fragmentation. And once again, like the central kind of theme of the book is like a body stitched together, you know, such that we no longer get to have a life as a single thing, but rather life as patchwork. This substitution of representation for immediate experience performs a proto-version of Alan Turing's imitation game that we now call a Turing test. Implicit in Turing's essay is a conceptual division between the information that can be conveyed via a tool of representation and the hazy metaphysical difficulty of recognizing real thought in another being. Burkitt postulates that Victor's essential recognition is that matter is medium, which would naturally imply that lightning is life and speech is thought. Implicit in this combination is the collapsing of kind of Cartesian mind-body dualism and also an echoing of Coleridge's equation of manifold terms with their underlying identity. The machine that acts is the mind that thinks under this logic. This simple conflation continues into our contemporary technological fields, in which writers like Rodney Brooks, former head of MIT's Artificial Intelligence Laboratory, and inventor of the Roomba, if that's his claim to fame, intentionally describe the human mind as hardware and software while offering the term specialness sort of derisively to denote the false binary that separates humans from machines. Shelley's novel accepts a version of this idea by allowing that a fully cognitive creation can exist, and speculates further about how it would enter into reflection about the nature of its own existence and how to represent its life. Nikolai Geron reviews at length the indebtedness of the idea of the robot and artificial life to the publication and dissemination of Frankenstein in not only the literary tradition, but also in public and scientific debate, discussing the ethics and pragmatic concerns of scientific creation. As a predecessor to modern ideas of creations that threaten the specialness of human beings, Frankenstein is a foundational text for its technological framing and its ethical complexity. The creature attempting to communicate with Victor his ethical duty to his creation first has to navigate its own convoluted relationship to time. After coming to terms with its tangle of sensory perception, the creature relates its primary impressions as varying between light and dark. So this is like right after the creature attains what we would consider consciousness. It then comes to term with the sun as the gentle light that stole over the heavens, followed by a larger perception of how several changes of day and night passed and the orbs of night had greatly lessened when I began to distinguish my sensations from each other. The use of the first person places the reader inside the creature's consciousness, which still displays a primitive relationship with time several pages later, when the creature has come to live in the hovel alongside his beloved exiles. Having remained during the space of several revolutions of the moon in my hovel, this diurnal understanding of time develops as the creature develops a seasonal knowledge as well. Quote, as the sun became warmer and the light of day longer, the snow vanished and I beheld the bare trees and the black earth. And then finally, the creature's thoughts became more active in relation to continued experience of itself and its voyeuristic empathy with the French exiles. The past was blotted from my memory, the present was tranquil, and the future gilded by bright rays of hope. So we get this almost like Maslow's hierarchy of different ideas of time that the creature engages with before we're able to access consciousness. And I always think this is like the moment when Mary Shelley is like, you have to build all these like conceptions of time before you can start building thought, or like an idea of the social, or even an idea of the self. While these conceptions of temporality are reported to us from the position of the mature creature reiterating its production in time, they also propose alternative forms of temporal experience and perception. The patterns of light and darkness, or the sensations of snow, trees, and earth, are counter-temporalities to the dated material of the novel's found texts, or even the regular page numbers that organize the reader's linear motion. So there's a bunch of different times we're experiencing at the same time. And none of it's necessarily trustworthy, like how much of this is just the creature trying to get Victor to be like, look, what would a scientist think would happen? It's like, so it's interesting. Everything's always fraught. Like Mary Shelley gives you no easy answers. In her careful representation of the creature's recitation, Shelley offers the reader the problem of information and transmission from yet another perspective. Readers are forced to become concerned with time as they find themselves sensually confronted with its plasticity. Herschel's equation, which assumes the movement of consciousness occurring above a denominator of standard time, is contradicted in the text by a time that is only ever relational via sensation and contingency, uncertain in its communication. The problem of Victor's reduction of life to electricity is echoed by the problem of reducing the novel's information to the linear passage of time, or even to a recognizable pattern of time that would establish a consistent rhythm. Thus, readers enact the position of beings concerned with time's plasticity, even as they are reading a first-person account of a being coming into an awareness of time as relational. So there's always a bit of a feedback loop. And I'd like to finish up a little bit by returning to Ada Lovelace's notes, which is the piece that I shared with everybody before the talk. And so this is Lovelace talking, writing pretty much just a touch later than Shelley. Again, it might act upon other things besides number. And she's talking about the analytical engine, where objects found whose mutual fundamental relations could be expressed by those of the abstract science of operations, and which should also be susceptible of adaptations to the action of the operating notation and mechanism of the engine. Supposing, for instance, that the fundamental relations of pitched sounds in the science of harmony and of musical composition were susceptible to such expression and adaptations, the engine might compose elaborate and scientific pieces of music of any degree of complexity or extent. And then I'm just going to read two more quotes from her. Those who view mathematical science not merely as a vast body of abstract and immutable truths, whose intrinsic beauty, symmetry, and logical completeness, when regarded in their connection together as a whole, entitle them to a prominent place in the interest of all profound and logical minds, but as possessing a yet deeper interest for the human race, when it is remembered that this science constitutes the language through which alone we can adequately express the great facts of the natural world, and those unceasing changes of mutual relationship which, visibly or invisibly, consciously or unconsciously to our immediate physical perceptions, are interminably going on in the agencies of the creation we live amidst. Those who thus think on mathematical truth as the instrument through which the weak mind of man can most effectually read his creator's works, with regard with especial interest all that can tend to facilitate the translation of its principles into explicit practical forms. And what you'll notice here, I mean, I know it's a little bit drawn out, and I've been talking for a bit, but what you notice is like it's very similar to Coleridge's idea that there's a kind of primary language which we seek to kind of understand pieces of and to rearrange to have access to these, like what she calls a kind of mathematical universalism, what he calls a primary imagination. And what's really interesting is that this is coming out of literally the specific set of writings that we recognize as the first computer language. So the kind of philosophical underpinnings are profound, are not just inextricable, they're almost identical to this idea of the Romantic Gothic in the period. And then finally, this is the final quote from her. We may say most aptly that the analytical engine weaves algebraical patterns, just as the jacquard loom weaves flowers and leaves. Throughout her writing, Lovelace returns over and again to conceptions of art, music, poetry, and nature to engage with the conceptual horizon of a thinking machine. Out across the infinite ice floes over which Frankenstein's monster disappears from sight, the hypothetical goal of the mechanical mind is not a departure, but a Gothic return to the human. As artificial intelligence is increasingly incorporated into our daily lives and institutions and trumpeted as progress into an opaque futurity, it is worth pausing to consider whether its patterns, polemics, and possibilities are a return at last to the foundational questions about industrialization and the human posed by these romantic thinkers. All right, that's all. Thanks so much.
Oh, thank you so much, Tobias. That was